Hello, we are going to start chapter 3 of the Mystical Marriage today, the spiritual life according to St. Maximus the Confessor, which is a series of reflections or lecture series from Elder Emilianos of Simon Petra, given to a group of monks on Mount Athos, and then translated into English into a book form. Again, the structure is you read one of St. Maximus the Confessor's 400 texts on love, and then the elder would lay out what it meant, which has been incredible for me. And sharing this with somebody earlier, this is the first time that I've made it this far in the book. I've had this book for probably a few months now, and got through that first chapter and knew that I wasn't going to get very far. And so this is kind of the first time that I'm going through this material, so I may not read it as long-winded as kind of some of the last ones. And this is more so for me to kind of read this and then think about kind of what it means. And as I was reading this section before I read, I kind of came up with a title for this to be St. Maximus the Confessor and the Biology of Sin, because he is going to lay out a very practical way of interpreting and understanding, and then maybe even seeing where sin comes from. And again, I mean the most minute of sins, which is pretty awesome, right? This is the smallest ways in which we become off kilter, which kind of become the bigger ways. So I'm going to read this. I'm going to read the chapter on love and then the reflection, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the chapter a little bit more. So here's the text on love. The one who throws off self-love, which is the mother of the passions, will very easily, with God's help, set aside the others, such as anger, grief, resentment, and all the rest. But whoever is under the control of the former is wounded, even if unwillingly, by the latter. Self-love is the passion of the body. So throwing off self-love and tying it to being the mother of the passion is why I want to make the biology reference. It's why I want to make the biological reference there, because just in a very simple way, that it seems like this is where kind of you getting off the mark originates from. You can kind of call it the root, if you're thinking about it in terms of plants or in terms of plant life. Or the mother, what the mother does is she gives birth, she continues the life process, right? And so self-love, or the way that we're going to reflect on self-love, again, this connection's been made to the mother. Note that if you get rid of self-love, you get rid of the others: anger, grief, resentment, and all the rest, right? The one who gets rid of self-love will easily get rid of the others. And that's it. Doesn't mean that the others are not there when you have self-love, because they're all there, kind of continuously working together. But if you get rid of self-love, you get rid of the others. And then the next thing is I'd like to talk about is where the last little section where it talks about self-love being the passion for the body. And so again, this is going back to St. Maximus's interpretation of the body and the sensible realm, which is kind of where the body is tied to. It's tied to our senses, and that's in a very, very practical way. It's nothing, high theology right here. It's a very, that is tied to, remember, our aesthetic practice. So, and then our following of the commandments. So the ability to follow the commandments is tied to how we take away the sins of our body, right? We kind of remove ourself by attaching ourselves to God and to the commandments, and that clears our mind from mental images so we can pray without distraction. But if you're having self-love, which is the love for your body, then you're always tying that to material things. You're always tying your body to something in the world. And that produces an image, that produces mental impressions for you to kind of connect yourself to. And in doing that, you're unable to pray without distraction. So again, here's the chapter, and then I'm going to read the reflection from the elder. The one who throws off self-love, which is the mother of the passions, will very easily, with God's help, set aside the others, such as anger, grief, resentment, and all the rest. But whoever is under the control of the former is wounded, even if unwillingly, by the latter. Self-love is the passion for the body. This is the reflection. There is only one thing that can drag me down from my ascent to God. There is only one thing that can overturn every single spiritual accomplishment, that can turn a saint into a sinner and indeed a devil, that can take whatever is good and beautiful and noble in the eyes of God and reduce it to something wretched, base, and utterly lost, namely self-love, which is passion for the body. Here we understand the body in a manner consistent with the Father's, so that it means the bodily mind, the mind of the flesh. It is the dark earthliness of the heart, the orientation and disposition of the mind toward things that are not suitable to the spirit. In this chapter, St. Maximus does not distinguish between the body and the soul, because such a distraction would have no meaning or relation to the passion of self-love. Self-love is something that arises in the soul. It obviously stems from more of an inward condition than an outward bodily one. But because self-love most frequently manifests itself through the body or through our attachment to the body, where its movements and activities are so clearly manifested, St. Maximus uses the more inclusive word body. This is very important because in our current context, right? You know, we follow the Cartesian model of I think, therefore I am. So notice that this is gone here in Maximus, right? Because Maximus, when he's talking about the body, he means your mind's connection to your body. So everything about the way Maximus is speaking about a person is connected, right? Everything is, you know, kind of one thing, which is interesting. One thing I'd also like to note is, you know, at the beginning, it's like, there's only one thing that can drag me down from my ascent to God. Anytime you're talking about a biological system, right, if somebody says something is a 100%, right, there is only one thing, right? If there's something where there's one, it's a very impressive moment in biology, because that doesn't really happen that much, right? Biology is a very diverse, lots of diverse things work, right? There's lots of ways to work and adapt and change and shift. And so the distinction here is that this is the thing, right? This is the one thing that we need to focus on. And that's important, right? Because it's not talking about, it's not talking about the big sins, right? It's not talking about the breaking of commandments like murder or adultery. It's really talking about Christ's interpretation, right? And so when Christ interpreted the commandment of murder, right? He said anybody who's been angry at their brother. And so that's a rejection of self-love, because there's no bodily attachment to the commandment, right? Even if you're angry, you know, that's in the mind. It doesn't matter that you've murdered. You haven't murdered, right? You should, because you're still angry. That's where Christ's interpretation of the commandments lifts them from the body up into the spirit and moves it to heaven, which is pretty interesting. So if someone attains the heights of spiritual life and subsequently falls, it will be because of self-love. This is because, as I've told you many times, self-love is the turning of the mind back to the self, which at the same time signals our rejection and abandonment of God. It's a breaking of the first commandment. St. Maximus is not speaking about selfishness, hypocrisy, pride, or vainglory, or arrogance, or conceit, but about the ego, which alone is able to impede and block movement toward God. And when we have been raised up to God, Self-love is the only thing that can drag us down from heaven and cast us back to the earth. This is why he says we are absolutely safe only when we throw off self-love. Looking at it from another point of view, self-love is like the root from which all passions sprout up within us. Like weeds, if you pull one up, more will follow, since the root system is below the surface. But what exactly is self-love? It is an attitude of mind, a disposition, and above all, a judgment, which is filtered through the prism of the ego. One of the best definitions of evil that I've ever heard, and this is something that's always been interesting to me, especially knowing, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. Evil is a force acting as if its knowledge is complete. And I think when you read about self-love, and this is very scary when you think about the way we interpret the world, things like my truth, right? That what I think is important. It's very, very interesting when you consider the way that the elder speaks right here. It is like a film that's covered the eyes of my heart and prevents me from seeing the world clearly because everything is distorted through the lens of the ego. Whatever I think or see or desire that has its origin in my ego or self-will will surely separate me from God. Only the denial of my ego can prevent me from being violated and wounded by the passions. One can be perfectly purified of the passions, but such purity can be lost, and all the passion can quickly return. All I need to do is return my focus to myself, and the passions will be there waiting for me. One thing that as I read that popped up is that one of the things that Paul said. One of the things that the Apostle Paul said is, "I'm crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me," right? And he also said something that, to the effect of, "To live is Christ, and to die is gain." And again, if you're just looking at that from a practical sense, right? I mean, if he's just talking about ego, and I think if you want a very cool interpretation, you can look up Jung's interpretation of ego death and kind of what that does for a human being in terms of transformative experience. There's a lot of also connection between Jung and the work of the Confessor, right? There's a book about that that's pretty, that seems pretty awesome by an academic, Tempas is his name, which is pretty cool. You can see from this point of view that self-love is not a passion, by which I mean it is not one passion among many passion, but it is rather the origin or starting point of them all. Remember, it's the mother, right? The mother, the root system. The ego is the root system of the passions. Just as God is the beginning and principle of every good, so too is self-love the beginning and principle of everything that is bad. Why did the devil fall? Because of self-love. The devil did not at any point have any passion within him. He was still an angel and thus without passions. God did not create evil, which means that self-love in and of itself is not evil. But when it becomes evil, when it is identified with my ego. When I see the world and God himself through the distorting glass of my self-regard, my self-will. From the movement that Lucifer began to imagine that he would be God, he fell. When the human person made a similar mistake, he also fell and obscured the image of God that he bore within himself, which is that, if you've ever studied Jung, that's an incredible statement, right? Because everything about Jung was image, and what the psyche is producing, the image of God that the psyche is producing in you and how you're identifying with it. That's what all the archetypes, that's what the archetypes, again, kind of were. And that connection there, again, just makes a biology, it kind of grounds, this is not just a theological lesson, right? This is talking about how human beings operate, which is pretty cool. When the human person, and this is an interesting statement because I don't mark things in books like this. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I just don't. But this is one of the only things I've ever marked in this book. Thus, self-love is the only thing we need to be vigilant about. Sorry, I'll read it again. Thus, self-love is the only thing we need to be vigilant about. And I just found that statement to be unbelievable. In our lives, we are all vulnerable to the extent that we live with our discernment, lacking any kind of objective or accurate judgment when it comes to ourselves. But let us return to the text. And so the elder kind of went off on just a little tangent right here. So again, this was a lecture that he gave. So he kind of gets off on this, but this whole little section is so cool. I'm going to read it one more time as a group. Thus, self-love is the only thing we need to be vigilant about. In our lives, we are vulnerable to the extent that we live without discernment, lacking any kind of objective or accurate judgment when it comes to ourselves. It means that you don't get out of not knowing who you are in the deepest sense, right? If you don't have the ability to say, this is, I'm following God, I'm giving myself to Christ, right? You're always going to be kind of in the wind because everything is subjective, right? It's all relative outside of that one thing. And so that's one of the reasons why it becomes so complex, right? If you're the ego acting onto the world, everything is, it's combinatorially, I'm forgetting the term, combinatorially explosive, right? There's so many decisions, there's so many options, there's so many different ways that you could act that you don't know what to do, right? Unless you can kind of tie it back to God. And that's what the mystical marriage would allow you to do. Having shown us the starting point for every fall and every passion, St. Maximus turns his attention to the one who actually brings such falls, who tempts us throughout our whole lives, namely Satan. According to the Fathers, Satan's not a metaphor or an abstraction, but an actual personal entity. If we deny that the evil in one is a personal entity and think he is some sort of impersonal state or condition, like an evil habit or an inclination, we will encounter no end of problems when we try to read the writings of the Fathers, not to mention the New Testament. Only when we acknowledge that the evil one is a personal entity can we even begin to solve such problems. To the extent that we make that acknowledgement, we resolve various difficulties in our lives. But it also enables us to safeguard ourselves from the devil, who knows how to incite and stir up our ego. This is why St. Maximus says, either the demons tempt us themselves, or they arm those who do not fear the Lord against us. They tempt us themselves when we are alone, away from others, just as they tempted the Lord in the desert. They tempt us through others when we associate with them, just as they tempted the Lord through the Pharisees. It is for us to look to our example and beat them back on both fronts. So that's all I'm going to do today. I thought this was a pretty cool section, and look forward to reading on about that in the next reading.